Hello, and welcome to today's video. Today, I'm going to be taking you through all the books I read in May. Today is May 31st, but I don't believe I'm going to be finishing another book today, so I'm just going to take you through everything I read this month. I read a lot this month. I have been reading a lot of books. I didn't finish a lot of the books I'm reading. I'm like in the process of reading like 6 different books currently, but I was really focusing on reading shorter books and also reading a lot of poetry. I have a lot of poetry books on my shelves from like when I was in middle school, and I've been going back through and reading those. So I read some Rupi Kaur this month and some other poetry books as well, and I read a new all-time favorite book this month that I can't wait to tell you all about. But this month was an interesting month because I was finishing finals at the beginning of the month and then moving home at the end of the month. So most of the books I read were at the end of the month. I read like, I'd say 6 books in the past 2 weeks, maybe even more. So it's been really nice to be home. I just bought a ton of new books, so I've just been really enjoying reading, and I have a lot of awesome books I can't wait to share with you, and I have a lot of inspiration to do more booktube videos, which I love, and also still doing vlogs, but just balancing and doing a lot more. But I'm really excited, so let's get on with it. So this is my beautiful stack. I read a lot of new types of books this month, not typical of what I typically read. I've really been trying to branch out and read different books than what I typically read, and a couple of these books were books that I put down that I finally picked back up. So that was a very fun journey and sort of typical. I definitely read some slower books at the beginning of the month, and that kind of put me in a little bit of a slump, but I did read some really great books. So I'm going to take you through the first one, which is Gods of Jade and Shadow. I've had this on my list for quite a bit. It is centered around Aztec mythology in the Mexica area, in Mexico City, and it is about a girl. It kind of plays off of the Cinderella story. She is working at her family's home. She's kind of like a peasant, treated as a peasant, and she discovers this box in her grandfather's room, and it leads her down this like crazy journey with this Mayan god. And it's just a really interesting story. Like, the concept was really good. I just personally found the book really slow and hard to like the characters, and until like halfway through. I actually put this book down at 100 pages a while ago, a couple months ago, and then I finally picked it back up because I needed to read something, so I picked it back up. It wasn't my favorite. I think it was a really interesting story. I really love Mayan culture, and it's something I don't know too much about, but it was definitely hard to get through in a lot of ways. But I think it is a really interesting topic, and I unfortunately don't think like the culture and like the story around it was explored as much as I would have liked. It was more of just like a fantasy story, like an adventure story, and doesn't really delve in as much to the Mayan culture as I wish it would have, and the way in which I heard it talked about. But I do think it is also maybe better for younger audiences. I think the main character was a little definitely naive and young, and it made it hard for me to like her because she was very arrogant and in a lot of ways, and was just very sheltered. And she did eventually come out of that, but it was just hard for me to get through that. So I'd give this book 3 stars, which I still think is generous, but I do think it is worth a read if this is something you'd be interested in. The next book I read was Freshwater. I started this, I believe, in April and finished it in May, and it took me a little bit of time. I had to put it down. It is a very heavy book, and I couldn't see where it was going, but then when I picked it back up, I rushed through it, like obviously absorbing it, but it was so good. I really, really loved it. It's about a child named Ada, and she's born into a Nigerian family. She's basically possessed, I would call it, by a Nigerian deity, and she turns to having multiple different selves within her, kind of like dissociative identity disorder, but I don't know if it's actually illustrated as such. And also, this is something that's like really deep in Nigerian culture, so I don't want to like put a label on it. That isn't my space to do so. But it was a really beautiful book. She moves to America, and it's like about her experiences, and she experiences trauma, but it's not like really detailed in the book. I found it to be digestible and central to the story, I think, to understand like what she went through. And it's just a really beautiful book, a really captivating book, really unique and interesting perspective, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's just a beautiful book, and I would recommend it for sure. And obviously make sure to read up on the trigger warnings, but an incredible book. So, like I said, this month I definitely went out of my comfort zone, and this is another book that I put down for a little bit, Hiroki Murakami's Kafka on the Shore. My friend actually gifted this to me for my birthday, I believe, last year or a couple years ago, and I tried it, put it down. I was just not in the headspace to really like focus on this book, and then I picked it up, I believe it was like when I was almost done with finals. I think it was like actually a couple days before I moved, because I was running out of books to read and I was like pushing myself to read something different that I was kind of trying to finish reading all the books on my shelf that I'd abandoned, and I'm glad I read this book. Really great book. It's like magical realism, which is a like genre that I really enjoy reading, and it's just so wacky and goes all over the place, and then like kind of like lines up. You kind of don't understand why they're talking about this character, and then it comes together. Basically, it's about a boy who runs away from home, and he kind of goes on this crazy adventure and eventually ends up at this library. It's so cool, and there's like multiple different storylines. There's a story that it has about like something that happened during the Japanese War from like 50 years ago, and then that ties into the story. It's just so beautiful, like the way he ties in different stories and weaves them all together, and just so many random things, but it was so good, and I really want to read more Hiroki Murakami. I actually unfortunately didn't pick anything up when I went to the bookstore like 2 days ago, but it's okay. I can always go back. But great book. I believe I gave this 4 stars. It was like a little hard to get through at points. It was just like, why is this happening? But then I became like had begun to like really appreciate the writing, and it like illustrates things that I've never seen an author write about, like somebody using the bathroom, eating, like these like daily things that like are never really written about in a book. I feel like that was a really interesting thing to read, and I will say the ending wasn't the ending I was really hoping for. In a lot of ways, it just like didn't satisfy me. Maybe I need to reread the ending, but I do think it was a beautiful book, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm really eager to read more of his writing, but this is definitely like a 4-star book, maybe 3.5. The next book is The Firestone by Tanya Huff. This was recommended to me by somebody in my stream community. A really great book. It's about this thief who gets caught by this prince, and then the prince decides to like kind of keep him. That's a weird way to put it, but decides to not execute him and kind of like take him on as like this person he kind of just wants to take care of, and then they go on this crazy adventure, and it's kind of about like, it kind of shows like their growth and their healing, because they're both like really struggling with things, and then there is some romance, and it's just a really interesting story, and I really enjoyed it. It's a standalone book. Really enjoyed the writing. I highly recommend it. It's a really quick book, a really like captivating book, and I'd highly recommend it. I definitely want to read more of Tanya Huff's work, and it reminds me a lot of like Tamora Pierce's work in a lot of ways. I do believe they're like from the same time period, or wrote in the same like era, but this takes place in Canada, I believe, or a lot of her books take place in Canada. I'm not sure if this one does, but it's really interesting, and I do believe she's a Canadian author, and I just really enjoyed it. So, and these are also really cheap. Like I got this for $4, so if you're looking for like a cheap read, because I'm always looking for those, I highly recommend it. Wow, I've been talking for so long, and I still have 5 more books to get through. These will probably be faster though, because they're poetry. The first poetry book I read this month was No Matter the Wreckage. This was recommended to me by another person on stream. Never read this before. This was like one of the poetry books that I hadn't had on my shelf to read, like that I've read before. A beautiful poetry book. I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend it. I really like the way it was formatted. It was formatted, I believe, in 7 or 8 different sections, and it starts off with like these really cool drawings that kind of like highlight some of the stuff that's going to happen in the poems, and it's really illustrative and like really well done. I think like it left me really satisfied. I didn't feel like some of the poems were like haphazardly put together. It felt really like well thought out, and I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. One of the best poetry books I've read this month so far. I still have like 5 more to get through, but I really recommend it. The next poetry book I read was Beautiful Chaos. I gave this 3 stars. It was really simple. Again, this was like from the era of like probably 2015, 2016, when it was just like kind of random poetry books I picked up. I don't remember like really what was happening back then, but I just like got all these poetry books. This was very simple. I think there are some things that stood out to me in this, but basically the way it's set up is these poems on one page and then this like photoshopped illustration on the next page that are definitely just like stock images. I think the images luckily did like line up with the stories, with the poems, but there weren't really anything in this book that really stood out to me. It was honestly just like pretty disappointing and felt kind of like Tumblr poetry, and I like always feel bad like criticizing people's art because I understand that art is so subjective and it is made in so many different ways and with so many different intentions, and your art is just as valid if no one else likes it, like, and my opinion like should not influence your opinion or should influence the perception of this art, because this is art and this is just the way in which I interpreted it and felt about it. Like, I personally did not like it, but maybe you will, and that's like I think the beauty and the ugliness of stuff like this, like commenting on people's art and stuff like that. It can just be misinterpreted and misconstrued, and I don't want to ever like hurt somebody's feelings. Like, your art is so valid no matter the what like public perception of it, unless obviously it's harmful, but like, I don't know, just take everything I say with a grain of salt. I think that's all I'm trying to say. Next book I read was Milk and Honey. So this is the first rupee card book I've ever had. I do have The Sun and Her Flowers, which is the book I read after this. Again, kind of like what I said with Beautiful Chaos. I liked it. It was definitely like, it felt, compared to her other writing, it felt really young, because I do think this was like one of her first poetry books, if I'm remembering correctly. It's definitely like shows like the potential of her writing, but I think compared to her other books, this is not up to her standard that I hold her at now, if that makes sense. There were some really beautiful poems, but also like I found a lot of them to be like really upsetting and triggering, because it is a lot like about like trauma and stuff like that, and it was just not something that like I totally enjoyed reading. And again, it like I can totally see like where she was at in her healing stage at this point, and I understand like where the writing was coming from, but I think compared to her other books, it did not hit me as hard, or like wasn't as profound as some of like as I've found some of her other writing. It is interesting to like see the old, like, so these tabs on it are tabs from like when I was younger, like when I first read it, and I think that's cool to like see which ones used to really hit me and like which ones I really liked. And also another thing is like there's so little on each page, and I know like you can have profound words in like so little amount, but like I don't know. It was, I enjoyed it, but I don't think it was, I guess, as profound as I used to think it was, if that makes sense. So now we have The Sun and Her Flowers. I liked this one a lot more. She seems a lot more mature in this book, like a lot more wisdom and life experience, and I really enjoyed this one. I think it, like, I get also like the book difference, like this one's kind of flimsy and like the paper's really thin, but then with this one it has like this really nice cover and really thick pages, and I really enjoyed this one. I believe I gave this one 4 stars, and there were definitely more that stood out to me, and it felt more well articulated and thought out. Like, there are shorter poems, but there also are these stories, and this is these really well done poems that I really enjoyed, and I think the illustrations were better, and again I think like the structure of the book made it a lot more enjoyable, and there were definitely more poems in this book that stood out to me. The way I like mark my poems I like is I sometimes just like put hearts or something at the top of them. But yeah, this one like shows a lot more healing, and not that I think like you can't write about your trauma, of course not, but like I think this one really gave me more insight and hit me harder, maybe just because of like the stage I'm at in my life, in my healing journey, but I really enjoyed it. Okay, so this is not like the last book I read this month, but it is my favorite, so I saved it for last. I Felt a Funeral in My Brain by Walton. I have had this book since I bought all those other poetry books. Like, I've had this book for at least 4 or 5 years. Never read it. It's just sat on my shelf, and I finally looked at it and I was like, we gotta do it. We gotta do it. And I don't know why I put it off, but I'm glad I did, honestly, because this hit me so hard. I loved it so much. It is a story, like kind of like a novel, but it's written in like poetry and prose. So it's like very spaced out and really rhythmic, and it's like a little under 300 pages. I read it in 3 sittings. It's about a boy who his mother is struggling with addiction, he's struggling or like coming to terms with his sexuality, and it's kind of like a coming of age type story, and he starts to struggle with addiction, and he's into poetry, and there's just so many interesting and beautiful things, and it was so beautifully written and so hard-hitting, and it's like a type of writing I've never read before in a story, and I do believe it's inspired by Emily Dickinson's I Felt a Funeral in My Brain poem, because that's the title, and it like kind of follows the structure of that poem. I'm actually gonna read you that poem real quick. So I didn't realize that it was an Emily Dickinson poem until I was talking about it on stream, and I looked it up, and that's what popped up, and I do have a book of the complete works of Emily Dickinson, so I like looked in here to find it. The title is I Felt a Funeral in My Brain by Emily Dickinson. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed the sense was breaking through. And when they were all seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race, wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. I've never read that out loud. I feel like when you read poetry out loud it hits you harder, but it is like, I do think it coincides a lot to like a lot of the stuff in the book, because in the book, I don't think I really explained this, it is him speaking at the eulogy of his grandfather coincided with like these stories from his life and this narrative from his life, and so like there will be these really interesting like breaks. I can't recommend this book enough. I absolutely adore it. I absolutely loved it. I'm probably gonna read it again next month. I can't begin to express how much I think you should read this book. It was incredible, and I think you'd like it. I hope you would. So yeah, give it a shot if it's something you're interested in. Maybe break out of your comfort zone. I definitely did, and I did not disappoint. If you have any recommendations like this book, please let me know, because I've been trying to find more books like this and have been having trouble finding them, so if you have anything, please let me know. That is all I read this month. I'm currently in the process of reading a couple books that I thought I'd tell you about. I am currently reading How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. This is an absolutely incredible book. I'm like 40 pages from finishing, and it's about like the history of racism and slavery in the US, and he goes to all these like historically racist sites and kind of talks about the history and the way in which the history is talked about, and talks about like the way we should present history today and how history shapes our present and our future. It's such a beautiful book. I believe he's originally a poet, so there's such beautiful writing and just such dense and important and powerful information, and I highly recommend it, even though I'm not done with it, but I can't wait to finish it. I can't wait to read more of his work, and this book is really, really gonna stick with me. I've learned so much. You can like see, I don't know if I can show you all this, but you can see like my annotations in this book. Like I have highlighted and written like notes on so many of these pages, and it's a really incredible book. And then the other book I'm currently in the process of reading is The Rune of Kings. I've had this book for quite a bit, and it sat on my windowsill, and I finally picked it up. It's great. I really enjoy it. I finally think it's picking up. I'm on like page 185. It's been hard to get through, but I also think like I'm kind of not... I'm getting back into it. I'm getting back into my fantasy love, but I think I was out of it for a bit, and I'm finally like eager for it again, so I've really been enjoying this book. It's so dense and like a ton of information, but it's fun, and I'm enjoying the ride. Well, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed seeing all the books I read in May. I hope maybe you got some inspiration. If you've read any of the books I've read, let me know what you think. I would love to know what you think of these books or any books you've read. Let me know if you have recommendations and videos you'd like to see or anything. I'd love to hear from y'all in the comments. But thank you so much for being here. I hope you have an amazing day, and I will see you very, very soon. Alright, bye!